Good afternoon. Dun Sengiku, Bipawabe, Umbiak Gendi. Welcome. Welcome to MIAC's Zoom lecture series. This is entitled Why We Serve. My name is Matthew Martinez. I am the current Deputy Director of the the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture here in Santa Fe. And with that, I want to acknowledge the place that I'm coming to you from. In Tewa, we refer to this place as Ohkay, which is White Shell Water Place. And with that, I encourage all of our viewers and our guests to acknowledge their own place that you're coming from and joining us here. We wish you well and good spirits and good health. Normally, we would gather at the museum in our auditorium and have our panelists talk and really engage in questions and conversations. And as the time is, we're not able to do that right now. Hopefully, in the fall, a lot of our programming will open up to be on site, and we look forward to inviting all of our guests and friends and relatives to join us at the museum. This afternoon, I have a great panel of esteemed guests. This really is a topic of our current exhibit that we have on display called Why We Serve. It's a traveling exhibit from the National Museum of the American Indian. And this exhibit chronicles the story of Native veterans and the armed forces from the revolutionary times to modern day times. And so NMEI created this exhibit as a pop-up. It's a 16 panel exhibit that details the story of leaders, of Native people, really thinking about their contributions to this country and really this larger question of why we serve. And I hope we can get into that this afternoon. And it coincides with the opening of the NMEI's Veterans Memorial Park in Washington, D.C. And so this is another attempt to really engage in our storytelling as Native people, but really as U.S. history and as global history. And so I encourage you all, if you haven't had time to visit MIAC, we are open 7 days a week from 10 to 5. And so come and see Why We Serve, as well as our other exhibits on display. We have a great exhibit by Kathleen Wall from Jemez, Pueblo, who is our Native Treasures 2021 artist. And in addition to that, we have an exhibit called Clearly Indigenous that features indigenous glass artists from throughout the Southwest, the Northwest, as well as artists from the Pacific Islands and Australia. And so with that, I want to introduce our panelists here. And I know you all haven't had much time to interact and see each other, but this will be a virtual introduction as we move forward. I want to introduce Miss Patricia Caté, who is from San Felipe, Pueblo, who is a U.S. Army veteran, owner of Indi-Genius Education, a place-based language and cultural development, instruction and training business, specializing in curriculum development, lesson planning, and strategic planning. She is also an educator and a language teacher in her own community there in San Felipe, Pueblo. So welcome, Patricia.
Thank you.
Next, I want to introduce Dr. Laura Tohe. She is Sleeping Rock People Clan, born for Bitterwater, and is a daughter of a Navajo code talker, a librettist, and an award-winning poet. Her books include No Pearl Today, Meeting the Spirit of Water, Sister Nations, Tsei, Deep in the Rock, and Code Talker Stories. She is Professor Emeritus with distinction from Arizona State University and is the current Navajo Nation Poet Laureate. And we'll get into this discussion here. And here is Dr. Tohe's book on Code Talker Stories. Next, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant Governor Michael Chinana from Jemez, Pueblo, who was born in Oakland, California, and moved to Jemez when he was 4 years old. He comes from a Tohe Jemez father and a Cherokee mother. Lieutenant served in the Air Force for 23 years, right out of high school. He's now retired and serving as first lieutenant governor of Jemez, Pueblo. And I'm wondering if this is what retirement looks like, serving in tribal leadership. And again, really thinking about this larger notion of service, not only military service, but tribal leadership as a lens of service. So welcome, Lieutenant Governor. It's an honor to have you join the panel here. I just want to, I guess, start with the question to our panelists about, particularly Patricia and Lieutenant Governor, about, this larger notion of why we serve. Personally, I actually do not know any Native family or community that does not have a veteran in their family or somebody who has served. And so, I want to ask you how you came into this notion of why did you join the Air Force, or why did you sign up for the Army? What was your inspiration and motivation, so to speak?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm First Lieutenant Michael Chinona from the Pueblo, Jemez. I'll get started. The reason why I joined the Air Force was my grandfather was a veteran of Normandy Beach. Growing up, he took me to the fields. He told me a lot of the stories that he was involved in. He told me he walked all over Germany for a whole year and wound up coming back home. My grandfather was one of the caciques of Jemez, so I was happy to be by his side. And then his sons, my uncles, there's three of them. The oldest is my father, Paul. The middle is my uncle Raymond, and the youngest is my uncle Sam. The two youngest were drafted. They were sent to the Vietnam War. So they both survived. They both came out, and of course they had their stories. And growing up at a young age, they did. It kind of fascinated me that the places they went and the stories that they had. So I kind of had that background, I guess, of a military service in my family. So growing up through high school, I didn't really think about the military till I was a junior. Growing up on the reservation here in Jemez, I wasn't really sure what I really wanted to do. I started putting in for colleges as a junior, and then at the last minute, one of the Air Force recruiters came to my high school, and I just said, well, I think I'll try to I'll just join the Air Force if I can get in. And they said I had good grades and stuff like that, and I took the whole year of just ROTC as my junior year, and then as soon as I graduated my senior year, I think I had 3 weeks off from high school graduation. I went straight into the military. So that was kind of my motivation. Was probably my grandfather and my uncle. I have to say the younger brother Samuel was the one that kind of motivated me to kind of like travel the world and just kind of see what was out there. So that's a little about my story.
Well, I come from a very long line of leaders and warriors in my family, not just in the military, but here at home. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, from both paternal and maternal sides have been war chiefs, governors. And I grew up listening to stories of when there was war in our communities and how you defend and the names of the warriors in our communities. So I grew up, both of my grandfathers served in World War II. One from Zuni that I never met. One, Mike Sandoval Sr. came home, served as governor, and his son, my uncle, Michael Sandoval Jr. came home. He inspired me a lot because I lived with my grandfather for quite a bit. And it's just a long, long list of family members. Like you said at the beginning, I do not know a family that does not have a family member that is serving now or has served. So on my maternal grandmother's side, my grandfather, he was a warrior, war chief for 8 terms. And usually in most Pueblos, it's four terms and then you're done. But my grandfather and my great grandfather, they both served 8 terms. And they're today, even today, they're still known as for their great leadership and their wisdom. So I do come from that strong background. And me, myself being born, I was born, I always tell people, you know what? I wish I was not made that way, but I'm not, because I always stand up for what I believe in, even when I'm standing alone. And later on, I read that somewhere on a poster, but that was always my motto growing up. I always stood up for myself or others. We lost quite a few in the military. My uncle Philip served 3 tours in Vietnam. He retired, and both of his sons went in the army also. My brothers, cousins, Sonny and Joey, Captain Philip, he retired last year. But at the same time, we lost a brother, my brother Joey, last year. He was still in the army, serving 21 years. He's a master sergeant. And that was really hard to take, because most of my family came home and served in leadership capacity in our community. There are a lot of cousins. My own son went out of, everyone in my family has served in the army, but my son decided he's gonna join the Marines. So he served in the Marines. My 2 nephews, about 5. So like you said, I have about 15, 16 people in my own close immediate family and an extended family that have served and are serving still. But one person only one female, my auntie Elaine, she was in the military, probably the first woman from our community that went into the military before I did. We were not allowed women to go into the military because we're supposed to defend close to home, right? They tell us, it means you defend that home. So we were not allowed to go, but my aunt did. And she served her 20 years, retired, seen Gulf War. But talking to her, she really inspired me to go, even though I had like a basketball scholarship way back when to go do what I needed to. But I just all of a sudden decided, no, I'm going into the army like my auntie. So I did. And I think that's why I went in, because I grew up with the stories of the warriors and how we defend our home. And I know it's such a controversy, but I'm sure that we'll talk about that later. But my Auntie Elaine, the first woman, she was very strong, and I followed her. I followed after her, and I went airborne. And people used to ask me, why did you do that? Why did you jump out of a perfectly good airplane? And I'm like, I just am made that way. So that it was my inspiration, and why I went is because I grew up with those stories of being a warrior. You defend your home, and I'm still defending my home many different ways.
Beautiful. Well put. Well put. And Dr. Tohe, I want to give a plug for your writings in your book here, but really you open the first page and there's this quote, "Why did you leave in the first place?" The answer to that is in the code. The code name for America was our mother. You fight for what you love. You fight for what is yours. Tom Hunter, Navajo code talker. And so right from the beginning, these narratives really draw you in as far as why people and why Diné particularly stepped into this line of service. And your father was a code talker. And so, I'll let you kind of add your insights from here.
Okay. Well, session A, Sana hab Laureate in Michigan Sana hab the college in Washington. John it was other dash chain on my education dash money. They Mesa, Arizona, will get it. Hello, my name is Laura Tohe, and I'm coming to you from Mesa, Arizona. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel with all these panelists who have contributed to our country. I was asked to write this book back in the early 2000s, and I went out to the Navajo Nation and interviewed 20 of the last remaining code talkers. At that time, there were many more. Now we think there's only 4 code talkers left. I, like many of the descendants, didn't know that our fathers, our grandfathers, uncles had served in the military, because when they were discharged, they were sworn to secrecy. So my father didn't tell us, or didn't tell me, until 1983, when I went to visit him, and he had just come back from a parade in Washington, D.C. And he talked a little bit about that, but he didn't say much. So I never knew my father was a code talker until many years later. In my family, I have 2 brothers that served during Vietnam. One was in Vietnam in special forces, and his job was jumping into the jungles in Vietnam where Agent Orange had been sprayed. So he had a lot of health problems as a result of that. My grandfather, who was my father's father on the maternal side, he was in World War I in Europe. And this is at a time when Native men were not considered citizens. So he enlisted in the military without being considered a citizen of the United States. So it wasn't until after that he became a citizen. So in my family, and my husband has served also in the Vietnam era. So this book that I wrote, I wanted to interview these men because at the time there were there were over 400 code talkers that served. And when I started this book, there were less than probably 50 or 60 code talkers. So I went out with a photographer. We went all over the Navajo Nation and contacted these men. And I asked if they could get their story from them. Some of them were reluctant and others were willing. But when I approached them, I would have spoke to them in the Navajo language. I explained what my project was and why I was doing it. And I think that made the code talkers that I spoke to comfortable in that I was going to get their story. So they allowed me into their lives and in some cases into their homes to get these stories. I recorded all these stories that they told me before, during, after, what happened to them when they came back from the service. And many of them talked about believing that they felt like they had something to offer. But when they enlisted, they didn't know that they were going to become code talkers. In my presentations, I talk about how the code talkers were selected by the Marines. And part of the selection was based on how fluent they were in Navajo and English. So when they were in California at Camp Elliott in the early 1940s, the war was on, and these men had enlisted. Some of them probably had never even left the state or even the homeland, and they were sent out to California. And they talked about how they were selected and then how the code was tested, because the at the time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were breaking all the codes that were being sent over the radio waves. So the Marines were desperate to find a code that could be secure, that could be sent over the radio waves, and that the Japanese could not break. And that was the job that the code talkers had to do. They had to come up with a code. And so they did. And they talked about how the code was developed, how they used different animals and place names and shortcuts to develop this code. And then my father, being one of them, he was sent out to the South Pacific. All of them served in the South Pacific during World War II. They did not go to Europe. And they talked a lot about many of the battles that they were in, where they served. And after I came home and transcribed the stories and listened to them again, I was deeply moved by what they gave up and where they went without knowledge of these foreign lands and having to go into a war, and especially in a war for a country that had mistreated Native peoples for so long. I was impressed by what they said. They felt like this was something they had to do, that they were there to defend the Hassan, Mother Earth. And it wasn't just that they were trying to defend the Navajo Nation homeland. They were talking about having to defend the entire country. They said that that's what we had to do. We wanted to protect the homeland and the future generations. And that's how their thinking was. It was like, we're doing this for everybody. We're standing up for everybody. We're willing to lay our lives down for that. So that was part of what I learned during my research with these 20 Navajo code talkers. And can I just show you a few pictures from my research? Okay. So this is actually the photo of the statue in Winter Rock, Arizona, where the Navajo Nation has honored the veterans. And you see the language here. With our language, we fought a war. In Navajo, it's Nehizat bin Dasiba. When the code talkers developed the code, they spelled everything phonetically. And this part here, Nehizat, is how we write the language now. But the code talkers spelled everything just the way it sounded. So that's the way the language looks today. And then, of course, it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which brought the code talkers into the war. And this man here has been credited for getting the code talkers actually to get this language made into a code, because Philip Johnson was raised on the Navajo Nation homeland. His parents were missionaries and teachers. And he brought this idea to the Marines to use the Navajo language as a code. There were other tribes that had done this, like the Choctaw, the Hopi, and some of the other tribes that used their language in World War I and World War II. And Johnson helped to get together a whole platoon of Navajo code talkers. I think this is a better view here. So this is the 382nd platoon, and they came from all over the Navajo Nation homeland, from Arizona, New Mexico, and southern Utah. I always think that the code talkers were uniquely prepared to be soldiers because they already lived these kind of harsh lives at home, because they had to haul water, chop wood, to bring those resources to the home to cook and heat their homes with. And not only that, they walked because a lot of the people didn't have automobiles. So they walked, or they rode horses, or they took wagons, or they hitchhiked. And so as soldiers, they were already in practice doing this at home. And these are just photos of them taken classes at Camp Elliott in San Diego. This photo on the top right is Carl Gorman, who was the eldest code talker. He helped to develop the code. Now we think it's always been said there were 29 original code talkers, but we think there are more because the records that were kept at the time, sometimes they were lost or there were mistakes on them. So we think there might have been actually 32 or 33 original code talkers. My father was not one of the original. He was one of the code talkers that came later. And this is the Navajo dictionary. I'm not going to go through it, but all the words here are spelled phonetically. And in this picture here, there's a lot of stereotypes of the soldiers and some of the things that they said about being in the military is that they were called chief, and they said they didn't like being called chief, but that's what they were, how they were called in the military. And then here's two of the code talkers sending and receiving messages. They would receive the messages in Navajo, and then someone would translate it into English and send the message on to whoever it was intended. And then they would send the message out in Navajo again. So they told me a lot about what they did while they were there. And I think, so they had to also make up names for some of this artillery, like fighter bomber. Dahitia means hummingbird. We had that word. Observation plane was an owl, and that's how they spelled it. So what they did is they took these names of artillery and they likened it to an animal. Like they said, what does a battleship do? And it goes underground. And so the word for whale became battleship. And submarine was an iron fish. And then they translated to Navajo fish. And then my favorite one is grenade. They call it potatoes because you can hold it in your hand and throw it. And that word was the mussy. So that was some of the things that they did. They were sent all over the Pacific Islands, and they went to Iwo Jima where they did some of the fiercest fighting. My father ended up here in Peking. He was hospitalized there for injuries. And so some of them went to China and the Philippines, the Marshall Islands, New Guinea even. So all these islands all over. They went there, and some of the code talkers actually ended up in Japan after the bomb was dropped to police Japan. So and then this is my father around 1944, 1945. He enlisted at 16 years of age. He was actually underage, but he got his parents to sign his permission for him. And these are just some battle pictures that he brought back with him. And then I'm just going to briefly talk about this PTSD treatment the Navajo people already knew about, the kinds of stress and disorder, illness that can come from being in battle. So they had already seen this in some of our stories of time immemorial. And these two, the picture on the right are the twin hero brothers that were sent into battle to help save the world. And this picture on the left are the battles that they were in. And then they also developed PTSD. So we had a ceremony for that, which was used then and it still is used today. So I'm just going to quit here. I don't want to take up all the time because I know there's the other panelists have things to share too. So I will stop it here.
That's great. Thank you for that historical context and really thinking about the all the intricacies of language that went into developing this code. And it's really this focus on cultural traditions, and that's that was evident that it's strong, but also just thinking about how this code essentially saved the country, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's the beauty of this story. But I'd like to ask Patricia and Lieutenant here, Thinking about your time in the service, what do you think set you apart as a Native service member, that you kept as a unique way to get through, being away from home, going through maybe tough times of conditioning or whatever the case may be? What were some of your connections to remembering who you are as a Native person in this larger kind of institution, right?
That's a very good question, Matthew. One of the main things that kept me in a lot of the travels that I went overseas and all that, my uncle would always, if I came home or I went overseas, my uncle Sam, who was one of the Vietnam vets, he made me tie our traditional feathers, and I would lay them on the ground of every base that I went to, or somewhere special where I would go to pray, and at any base that I was at. So I look at my travels and the places I've been and the prayers that I do here at home, those corners of the world that I've been to, I remember where my feathers are laid. So it makes me feel like I'm a lot stronger worldwide, not just necessarily in one place in the United States. So a lot of my prayers go through Saudi Arabia, the Kuwait, Japan, the islands, Guam, all those places where I laid my feathers at. So those what kept me strong. I always remembered that I have a home to come home to. And my prayers were always there. And I always had, if I had any issues at base or some hard time or something like that, I would go to that certain area and just pray so that I can get through that day or get through that week where tough times are going. And then I always knew that they were listening to me at home, and I always knew I can make it through. So that's one of them that I knew kept me strong in my faith and prayer, that I knew that someone was listening to me at home and that I can make it through. So that's one story I'll share. And it was wild. My uncle would never let me leave the house. So wherever I was at, even at the airport, he always grilled me and said, do you have your feathers? Do you do this, that? He made sure I took them with me no matter where I went. So I always give props to him and for getting me through my years of service.
Well, for a woman from the Pueblo going into the service, it's a bit different because men are privileged to certain prayers and rituals, whereas women were not taught that or privy to that way of prayer. But we do have a everyday morning prayer with our, of course, pet on our and every day we get up, we pray. Like I said earlier, that our place is to defend the home right out the door, and and what that means is like you don't have to go far to pray for your prayers to be heard. So it kind of roughly translates that way. So for myself, what I think got me through the training or airborne school or what everything that I had to go through was the prayer that I knew every day who I was. I am a Native American first. I'm a Jemez Pueblo woman first. And I always carried my pouch. When I first went in, that was questioned, that I could not keep it with me through my basic, but I told them, this is one of the things I do, this is who I am, I'm going to take it with me. So they took it from me for a while, but I still fed with my food until I got it back. But I always knew that I had to pray or feed morning, noon, and evening with my food and my prayers. And not only that, I always have a sense of home. We know who we are. I knew who I was, where I was from, and I chose this. That was one of the main things that is still today takes me where I need to go or what I need to do and be strong, is that I chose this. I chose to go and do the service. And no matter what I was dealing with or whatever was happening, I always kept that in my mind, and I never quit. And I knew I was going to come home. Even after my service, I stayed away for a bit, but my heart always called me home, because I know as a Native woman, or even as not just even a woman, our hearts call us home. And that's what kept me strong, kept me going. And it set me apart from others because some of them didn't know prayer or didn't have a faith base. I would say a faith base. They didn't have that instilled in them, which were us growing up Native. It's not a religion, it's a way of life. We did it every single day. We still do it every single day. We teach it. So it was just a way of life that distinguished what I did, and to call me home and bring me home, or bring, like I said, most everyone came home in my family. And I believe it was the power of our way of life and how we pray and how we're taught and what to do. And I still teach that to my children and my grandchildren, because that's strong. That is the main thing. No matter what they do and choose to do in life, that's always gonna have that strong faith base to stand on and who you are. And I believe that's still important, and I still teach that. And everyone, I hope, still holding on strong and teaching that now today.
And Dr. Tohe, I think about your father, who is 16 years old. I mean, these are kids. I was telling Lieutenant, I was watching the Santa Fe graduation, Santa Fe Indian graduation this morning, and despite graduating high school, they're still kids, right? And 16 years old, is just, you're traveling to the other end of the world. It could have been another planet to them. And what was going on in their mind as they boarded the plane and jumped into their training, or maybe you can share some of those stories of what that thought process was.
Well, when I spoke to Keith Little, he was a friend of my father's. They both went to school in Ganado Mission, and there were several of these young men that were there when the Pearl Harbor was attacked. Keith Little was telling me that on that day that happened, him and my dad and some of their friends were out away from the campus, and they were hunting rabbits, because he said on campus they didn't always get enough food, and they were young boys actually, and they were always hungry at that age. So he said they were out there hunting rabbits. And so they sent one of the friends back to the school to get salt. And so while he was at the school, he heard over the radio that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And he was all excited. He ran back to get the other boys, to tell the other boys what happened. And he said they all were stunned, and they didn't really know if even Pearl Harbor was part of the United States, and so they said they talked about it, and they went back to the school, and they said everybody was just listening to the radio. Nobody was doing anything else. And he said right then and there, some of the young friends there were saying that they were going to enlist. And some of them did enlist after they graduated from high school. And some, like Mr. Little, said he tried to enlist before he graduated, but they wouldn't let him in. They told him he had to wait a year or two. So that's what he did. Now, my father, being that he was 16, he actually lied about his age. So that's why he got in. And some of them were talked about how they felt like this was something that was new to them, because they talked about they were sent to these islands. And for Navajo people, going out to a strange land among foreigners is something that, they were taught to be careful of. So some of them did have ceremonies before they left. One of the code talkers had a ceremony in absentia. So he was serving, and his mother had a ceremony done for him so that he would be safe. And some of the other code talkers told me that when they came back, they had another ceremony done for them. And one of the code talkers' story was about the time when he left, he had a ceremony done for him to protect him. That's what many of these ceremonies were, for protection. So he had this protection ceremony. He came back, and the medicine man that had done his first ceremony was there. And he told him to take off his uniform. And he said, go bury it somewhere near your home. He said, don't ever put it on again, because that uniform is the war that you went to. And that's in your uniform now. So he said, you can bury that. And he said, you can go visit it whenever you want. He said, but don't ever put it back on. And so he said he never did. So, their stories were a lot about some of the things that they talked about was what it was like being on these ships being sent out to the South Pacific from Hawaii and Australia. And I was kind of concerned about asking them these male stories, because male stories have to do with war. And I didn't really ask them about that because I felt like I might be intruding on their stories, being a female. But the only thing I said was, tell me a story about being a code talker. And that's all I said. And they just told me hours of stories. But anyway, they told me about seeing bodies floating on the ocean, and then what it was like landing at Iwo Jima and seeing bodies all over the beaches and having to step over their comrades, and what it was like being in a foxhole, having to stay in that for days sometimes. So, they talked a lot about what it was like for them being actually in military life. And some of them said that they knew that when they got back, they were going to have a ceremony. Some of them did, and they were able to resume their life. Others didn't. They ended up being alcoholics, or having drinking problems. But then eventually, many of the code talkers actually they went back to their communities, and some of them became translators. They worked for the hospitals, became teachers. Some of them were elected to, office. So a lot of them were into doing that kind of service for their communities. My father came back, and he went to college very briefly, and his father called him back to work on the coal mine, because our family at one time owned a coal mine. So my father came back, and he had used his GI benefits for that. But he helped the family out for several years. So a lot of the stories were really about, most of them came home, some of them went other places to work. And it was very interesting to listen to the code talkers tell their stories. I felt very honored and privileged to get their stories.
Wonderful. I mean, what a privilege to really just sit down and listen to their stories. Lieutenant, I have a question regarding your experience in the Air Force, and really thinking about your world travels, and now you're serving your tribal nation. How do you think your service and the Air Force prepared you or shaped you to step into tribal leadership?
Before I go on, I want to acknowledge what Patricia said earlier about having her corn pollen taken away at basic training. That happened the same to me too. They took it away, and I was like, what? But they let me have it a couple of weeks later, and they let me have it on the weekends only. So I just wanted to add that to your story. That made me smile when you said that, because it make you take everything out of your pockets when you get the basic. And that's one thing I pulled out of my pocket, and they're like, what the heck is this? Is this drugs? Blah, blah, blah. And then I had to tell them what it was, and they're like, well, you can't have that. And then I went and talked to my drill instructor later on and said, I need to at least do prayer. That's how we do prayers. I'm a native, blah, blah. But he let me have it like every other weekend. So that's kind of funny when you said that, Patricia. But anyways, back to your question. Military, I was in the military for 23 years, and they groom you to lead, I guess. I mean, you start out 4 years, 8 years, and you're kind of like just in the beginning. But once you pass that 10-year mark, you become leaders of others. You become trainers, and people start looking for you for advice, and you're trying to give them more ways of getting through hard times in life. So when I retired in 2012, and what I think Laura was talking about earlier, or it might have been Patricia, I came home for the first year and they made me a war captain. And I was kind of like welcome back home right off the bat. They made me a war captain. So I was like getting back into the reservation life and a lot of the traditional side, which was, I haven't been a part of it really on an every year basis because I was overseas a lot. And then after I retired at 23 years, after my last 3 years of service, I was a production super of aircraft maintenance. So I was in charge of all aircraft maintenance and all back shops of maintenance. So I got to see a lot of different mentalities all around. I had, I think, 13 different shops I was in charge of. And each shop had their boss and their different mentalities. Was, we do this way, we do this way. And you just had to adapt to some of the issues that they brought up to you. So being made first lieutenant governor, it's almost the same concept. They put us, there's things coming from you all over the place. You're in charge of the education, you're in charge of the Department of Transportation, resource department. A lot of our Forest Service here, we have beautiful mountains here in Jemez, our water, our land issues, and there's all these different issues that you kind of try to help out and try to maintain and find answers for. And the military background, I think, helped me adapt to that, to a lot of the changes that people throw at you. And the one other issue, and I was thinking of this when I was driving home, the main issue that tribal leadership and tribal government is that your hours are 24 hours a day. Kind of like how the military is, you go to work, there's no 8 to 5. You're going to work at 6 in the morning, you're getting off at 8 o'clock at night. I never really knew what a weekend really was until I got out of the military. And it was funny when I first started working here on the tribal here in Jemez, people were taking off during lunch and taking 1.5 hour lunches. And I came out of the military, I was like, what the heck's a lunch? I mean, people are going for lunch for 2 hours, and then from 11 to 1, you couldn't get a hold of anybody. And I'm like, what's going on? And then 5 o'clock on paydays, everybody's gone. And I'm sitting there going like, what the heck? So the hour issues, time becomes almost non-existent when you become a retired military guy. I'm pretty sure Patricia, being an Airborne, her time was probably like straight. You probably can't remember your days, if it was Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. I mean, that's what the concept of almost tribal leadership is right now. I mean, my hours go from, I don't have a weekend. I mean, I get calls, you get calls at 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, and then you just learn to adapt and you just breathe and just take it. You can only do so much, is what the military told you. You can do so much. Never forget your family, no matter what, no matter how stressful your day is. One of my commanders says, no matter what happens during your day, you always have your family. Go back to them. And if there's issues with your family at home, they're the most important part of your life. The military can replace you later on in life as you go. Tomorrow we'll have somebody else in your spot, and just as it goes. So don't ever leave your family alone, is what they told me. So those are just some of the concepts the Air Force taught me. And I think it does help in a lot of my tribal leadership roles today.
It's a good reminder, thinking about what matters, right? And thinking our community and our families and all of you are very much involved and entrenched in those particular traditions and surrounding by your own relatives. And so that's a good reminder of that.
Matthew, can I just say something too?
Sure.
In regards to what Michael and Patricia said about corn pollen? One of the co-talkers said that the same thing, that what he did was he put his corn pollen in some chewing gum, and he said his prayer like that, and he put the pollen in there, and so he chewed the corn pollen, and he said he did that because he was afraid the officers would take it away from him. So that was how he solved his, he didn't want them to take away his pollen, so he put it in his chewing gum.
One thing I did one time in the basic was you had to tie your laundry bag to your bedpost, more or less. Your dirty clothes, you had to tie it to the edge of your bedpost. So I'd put my corn pod. I had two of them. I actually ended up getting another one for my dad. I said, well, they took one from me. Can you mail me one? And then my aunt actually made me another one. So I had a smaller one because the first one I took was kind of, my normal one's kind of a large size one. And then I told my dad, they took it from me. They found it. Can you make me a smaller one? So my aunt wound up making me one, a smaller one. So I kept that in my laundry bag on the bottom, kind of hidden away. So what do you call the drill instructors wouldn't go through your dirty laundry. So that was a good hiding spot for me. So that got me through my basic training.
Because you have to be in kind of creative.
Right. Yeah. And then I got a question for Patricia. I mean, you said how long were you in Airborne? Were you the whole time?
Well, it went right out of high school in '82. I served my 3 years active, and the rest of my term was active reserve. So every time conflict came up, we were one of the ones that went wherever they sent us. The first one was with the Desert Storm, and first we deployed to San Antonio was our startup base, and then from there, so total, I got my honorable discharge. Total time that I served in the Army, both active and active reserve, was about 26 years.
Wow. When I first joined the Air Force, I got stationed up in Anchorage, Alaska, which was one of my dream assignments. I really wanted to go back to Alaska because it's funny. My dad used to send me to Alaska my summer, so I wouldn't get in trouble here in Jemez. He'd buy me a ticket to go see my aunt in Alaska for the summer. So I thought that was the greatest thing in the world. So of course, when I joined the Air Force, I said, "Where do you want to go?" And my dream, I put Anchorage, Alaska. I said, "Send me to Alaska so I can get back up." But anyways, Anchorage was one of the primary bases. I can't remember the Army base there, but they had Airborne there all over the place. And they did all training. I used to sit there on the flight line and watch Airborne train. I was just totally amazed. I'm in awe of anybody that says they're in Airborne. I mean, they walked around the base and they're just like glowing, like, oh, it's so cool. I always had mad respect for them because we got to watch them train in Alaska. And I thought I was like 18-year-old kid watching Airborne else train in Anchorage as a young kid, and I was just like, man, these guys are actually doing this stuff. And I was like, wow. And it was right in my backyard because the helicopters and a lot of the Army were cross training with the Air Force up there. So I thought that was really neat. So
yes, it was a very hard course. There was at my beginning, I became Airborne at 18, but when I went through the training, we started probably with about, I don't know, they said about 1,500 to 2,000.
Yeah.
By the time we finished the course, only 6 women, I was one of them,
Wow,
and about less than 50 of us graduated.
And this is way back, what year was this?
82, 83.
Way, 82. Yeah.
Yeah, so we started with a battalion of it. And then it was sad because you're at the end of the day, you're watching formation, and half of that battalion's being marched off because they quit or something, they didn't pass. By the time we finished, like I said, there was only 6 women, and I was one of them. That's and in my graduating class, it was so small. There, like I said, it was like less than 50 of us that went through the whole and graduated. And I pushed myself. It was really hard, and I was in my little company that I was attached to going through the training. I was a female, and I was probably the shortest, even though I'm 5'4". I'm tall in Native American standards, but there I was the smallest, and I was the only female attached to my area. Well, there was 3 of us, but they made me go first for everything. It was like, yep, number 0. They gave me the number 0, and sure enough, they called me chief. I'm like, I'm not chief. You don't call us chief. Right. And they always made me go first, but I was like, okay, fine, if I can do it. And then they explained to me, like, if you can do it and the men can see you do it, they're gonna be brave enough to. They're all
gonna follow him.
Yeah, but yeah, sadly, we lost, like I said, quite a bit.
Right.
What was the hardest part about being
physical? The physical part, the physical is just all physical. You have to had a 50 ruck on my back. Even if you're going to jump, you're going to have your 50 ruck on your back. you have your parachute on your back, you have your reserve on the front, you have your gun, you have your, I mean, everything, and you have to walk to your plane, and then you have to get on, then you have to jump with that and be safe no matter what. If you're landed in water, or I hung up on a tree once, and that was, yeah, it was the heart, it's the physicality of it, and the mental, a lot of them just would come one day and like, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. And I'm like, come on, you signed up for this. It was your choice. Like I always go back to that. We chose this, right? I chose this, and I'm gonna be a warrior, and whatever comes up, whether I'm sleeping out at night or hanging from a tree, I'm going to do it. So yeah, the hardest part was, and missing home, and knowing that there's a feast going on or something coming up, and you're stuck out there hungry or cold or hot, or stuck with cactus. There's cactus everywhere, so you're no matter what. The hard part is that you just pray and say, okay, I'm here. I chose this. I'm going to do this, and I'll be fine. I'm going to be okay. You pray.
I have one of the craziest stories on the Airborne when I was in Saudi, and then during the height of the war going on, we would watch the 130s come in and bring personnel in. So of course the Airborne are coming in. I said, I'm going to watch the Airborne. I was always fascinated with the Airborne guys, just because we're Air Force and Army always gave us a hard time no matter where we were at. So in Saudi, they had that 130 coming in, and I took care of aircraft maintenance, ground equipment and stuff. So I would watch planes come in all day long. They said this 130 is coming in from, I think it was coming in from South Carolina or either North Carolina. And they said the Airborne guys are coming in at this time, like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. In Saudi, it's like 120, 125 degrees. So me and my buddy are sitting at the end of the flight line. It lands, we watch it land and watch it turn, and then the back door opens up. They're pulling out their half tracks and everything else. And the Airborne guys are coming in full mask, full backpack, everything, and they're marching out. And it's 125 degrees out.
Yeah.
And we're sitting out there. We have of course we have our gear with us, but we don't have our mask on. We're sitting there just watching them, and they're all coming out. They're all forming, and then they're always, someone's always barking orders to do what. And they came out full face mask, full everything. And I swear it was 120. It was a 125 almost every day. And they all came out. They stood there all in line, and they had their rucksacks on. They never take off their rucksack. They come out, door closes, and then the plane never shuts off. It just taxis off, takes off again, and then they just march out into the desert, straight out into the desert. No van, no. We're taking you to the spot. They just went out, and we just watched them, and I was like, whoa.
And sometimes they drop you, they tell you, okay, well, it's midnight now, because sometimes you don't know when you're in wherever you're going. And
Right.
That's how you generally, okay, well, it's midnight now, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we're gonna drop you, you gotta go 10 clicks here or whatever. And I hope you have everything, okay, boom, and there you go. And then you have to find your camp, whatever it takes, whether it's 10-mile hike or to get there, or
Right.
you're lucky, you're only hiking in that full gear, less than a mile, yeah.
I just want to say to both of you, to Michael and Patricia, your stories are amazing, and thank you for your service and everything that you have given. I know you had to make sacrifices. I'm, just grateful to what you've done for our country. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It doesn't look like there's any questions, but I enjoy these stories. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more that about your experience and your service, and so I think that's part of the intent of these programs is to really showcase stories, and and these are your stories, and there's gems in them too. So I appreciate that too and value that. Here's a comment from Connie Sosi Gasson.
Hey, Connie.
So everybody say hi to Connie. So
Hi, Connie.
She thanks you for your service. Her oldest son is active duty, Colonel Gasson, and her grandson Aishki is stationed in the Middle East, both Picaris and Diné. Her father served in the U.S. Army in Normandy, oldest brother in Vietnam, her uncle was a code talker. Another uncle is a POW plus other relatives. Do you know of active duty natives currently serving? I mean, I would think
Yeah,
so.
there's
Right?
there's quite a few here in Jemez. I think there's I can't remember. I want to say 16 active duty members in Jemez right now, and one of them is my cousin. She's in the Navy, but there is quite a few still.
Yes, same here in San Felipe. There's quite a few active male and female now. But yeah, there's quite a bit. Even my own first cousins are still serving actively right now. And like I said, my cousin, my brother, Joseph Velasquez, was served 21 years, 3 tours everywhere, Iraq, Afghanistan, Baghdad, in the worst military conflicts. Came home, lived through them, and last year we lost him to a hit and run. He's still stationed, he was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, and he's a master sergeant. Joseph Velasquez. He came home, and last year we lost him just a few weeks to this date last year to a hit and run. I mean, he survived combat tours, 3-4 tours, and served all of that. And we lost him to a hit and run, and they're still investigating, and that's the sad part. And they gave him military funeral honors at Santa Fe Cemetery, and yeah, he was featured in the Albuquerque Journal and the news. So I'd like to send out my heartfelt love to my uncle Phil and Wilma and his brother Sonny Philip Jr. That I love you, I honor you, and the service all of you made, the whole families in the military, and not only them, to my whole family out there, 16, some retired and some still in. I'm proud of you. Hang in there, you're warriors, you're leaders. And I love you all. And not only them, but I extend my blessings and prayers out to every single one who is serving now today, who has served in the past, and those who are going to be warriors in the future. Letra.
Thank you. That's nice. And Laura, I was just going to say, the code talkers. I was stationed at Kirtland here in Albuquerque, and I did a Native American Heritage Month in November back in 2010, and I had the code talkers there. I kind of had them sponsored to come out. There was 4 of them, and then and it's really good to recognize and respect those that have served back in those times. A lot of times, the Vietnam War and World War II, and they came back to a harsh nation, and a lot of the things they did, they weren't really accepted. So that was one of the things I wanted to do back then, and in 2010 I had them all there, and it was really nice. I tried to have a whole month of just showing Kirtland and those that really haven't seen a lot of our Pueblos and our dances and stuff like that. It was a really good time. And I Googled, that's what I was doing on the side. I was Googling it because I know I did it back in 2010. I was just kind of curious on the names that were there. But it's really good to know that you wrote a book about them, and it's really neat to. I did a little bit of research on them too, prior to them coming out, and a little bit after the fact too. And it's really neat to read some of the stories. It's really neat to see some of the pictures of the old drawings that they did back then. It's really amazing. And thank you for that. Thank you for writing a book on that too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. As I mentioned, we think there's only 4 code talkers left now. My father passed in 1994, but as far as the original group that we think 30 or more that developed the code, they are all gone now. The last one passed about 3 years ago. And then there's the later group, the ones that received the silver medal. And in 2000, the Navajo Nation did recognize the code talkers, all of them. And because my father wasn't there, my brother was there in his place. And it was a big celebration. So the one man that I know that's still living, his name is John Kensel. He lives out at Lucas Bay, Arizona, and I believe he's 101 now. Right. And he's still getting around. He has 2 canes,
Wow.
but he's, he's still out there.
Yeah, I Googled it. I had Peter McDonald and Roy Hawthorne were the two that were actually saying that code talkers. The other 2 were, like I said, on the I won't say on the side, but they were there too. The 2 main ones were Peter McDonald and Roy Hawthorne were the 2 that were spoken during that time back in 2010. So it was really neat. I got pictures with them and everything. It was really a really good time.
Yeah.
What's the status on the Navajo Code Talker Museum? Do you have any insight on that that being built, Laura?
Well, it's now at a standstill. They did get the piece of land out by Window Rock, but I understand the land was really rocky and difficult to put a building there. So from what I understand, that is just on hold now. But in addition to that, so that land was given to them for the museum, but there has, to my knowledge, not any money been raised for the museum itself, because the code talkers wanted the museum and also a healing place and an archives. So right now, no money has come forth. I think John Pinto, who was he was part of the New Mexico representatives, had received money from New Mexico, but what happened to that money, we don't know. And I know the code talkers and their descendants are still wanting to get that museum built and to make it a reality, but we don't know when that will happen.
And I just think there's a body of archives, right? The personal stories, memorabilia, newspaper clippings. I mean, there's a wealth of information that would be much looked at and researched and shared with families and communities. So I hope that gets off the ground at some point, because it's an important story for sure. And
Matthew, I got that book I was telling you about. A guy, my wife's of course an artist, and so in the market in Phoenix, I was just in the parking lot, and this old veteran guy was walking around, and then I said, hey, of course he had a Vietnam hat on, and I congratulated him for his service. We started talking, and we just struck up a conversation in the parking lot, probably like 30, 45 minutes, and we just talking away, and he had a book, and I wanted to show that to you. It's a Vietnam Warriors one. Now I'll send you his actual name. His name is J. Boyd Morningstorm. I think he was Wisconsin area, I think. And then it's all about his Vietnam story and his personal stories, where he was at and his basic and all that from one of the group. He was one of 3 surviving members of a platoon out in Vietnam, and he shares his stories pretty much in detail, kind of. But I just wanted to throw his name out to you, because it might be something. If you have another panel, he'd be a good guy to have out there too. And I just met him in the parking lot. He was we conversed for like an hour, so it was really neat.
I wanted to just add a little bit before we go on. I know when military come back from even just serving a little bit, it feels like nothing. I mean, like you come home and you're just integrated back into your community, like it's nothing. I mean, I'm not sure another better word for it. But my father-in-law, Felix Tenorio Sr., Pat is from Kiowa. He's the one who kind of got me a little bit more proud of the service, because he served in the Korean War. And he has almost the same story. He ran away from boarding school. He was 15 years old, went all the way up to Colorado and enlisted and lied about his age. But I was doing my master's thesis, and one of them was about to ask an elder all these questions and all that. And he gave me a story, but he made me promise that I wouldn't tell his story until he died. Well, we lost him about 2 years ago, 2-3 years ago. And I've never shared his story, but he's the one that made me proud of the service that you know, that whatever I went through or and all that, because he shared his story with me. And he gave me I wish I had it right here with me, but he gave me a beaded hat. It was all beaded totally of the American flag. And he gave it to me and he told me, I've never shared my story with anyone of what I went through with the boarding school time and running away from it and joining the military and everything that ensued and all that he went through. And he gifted that hat to me. And he said, none of my family, not even my wife or my children, know this story. And I'm really eager to write it. I may get in touch with you, Dr. Tohe. But and then after that, when he gifted that hat to me, I wore it every Veterans Day. I'm a teacher, so I've been a teacher for a long, long time in the classroom. So I never felt proud till that happened, and that was not too long ago. It was probably only about 6-7 years ago. So from that service to now, I'm not. I know how some people feel. It's like, okay, well, it happened, sir. We served, whatever. But until that time, I did feel proud to have even served a little bit or done my time or and I'd come home to my community and to be placed in leadership positions and be thought of in your community that you do have a purpose and you do have qualities that the tribal leadership need. And I've been a G2G government to government rep for the last 11 years in my community. I'm also appointed committee to the CARES Language and Cultural Program. So I've been in that committee for close to 8 years now. So I just wanted to put that out there that you should be proud. And I never saw it that way till my father that to me, even though I heard all the stories. So I want you guys to be, proud of.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of thanks to you all for your service and the chat and messages coming across. And obviously there's a history of honoring and a history of traditions that you all contributed to that. Dr. Tohe and your stories and your father and that whole generation is, obviously those stories continue to live and to be told. We're at closing time here. Again, I appreciate everybody's time and your voice and your perspective, and really just sharing your own lens as far as the topic and why we serve, and that larger history of Native honorings and Native traditions. So, with that, thank you very much. Good dawoha. Baikiri tampo okuntapo takiribo kuiwa sengwabiani. With that, thank you, and may your families be good and healthy, and your home communities. And we wish you well. And come visit MIAC. There's a lot of exciting exhibits happening on the Hill.